I am delighted to welcome you to the Ingenious You community.
Well, it's good to be with you, Melissa. Thank you for the invite.
Now, our listeners always like to know something about the backstory of the leaders that we interview. And in your case, you have a really interesting and what I think is somewhat unique pathway to the college presidency, particularly the presidency of a community college. So could you briefly describe your journey, how it started, which I know was in a different country, actually, and how you arrived in the president's office of a community college, and maybe also describe some of the key influences that helped to inform your journey along the way.
Sure. So I came to the United States as a little girl. I was 11 years old, and I came from Hong Kong, and our family was part of that chain migration that's
Mhm.
been talked about so frequently. My mom's side of the family has always been Chinese diaspora, doing business and working in Havana, of all places, in Cuba. So when Cuba fell to Castro, my uncle and my grandfather and my aunt actually, they all left and went to Puerto Rico. So I've got a couple of cousins who were born there, Felipito and Maria. So it's part of the international history of our family.
Mm.
And then they went from Puerto Rico to Miami, and that was my port of entry. So it was I'm pretty typical. When you come when you're 11, you caught on to the language pretty quickly. So I grew up in inner city Miami. I went to an inner city high school.
Mm.
But for one very, very caring English teacher, um, I would have been working in a shop somewhere, rather than being in higher education. Um, he was my English honors teacher, and he says, Pam, you need to apply. You need to apply to Columbia and be a journalist. And I said, okay. My parents were not English speakers. And so, we were the typical immigrant family where I was the first in my family to go to college. So interestingly enough, I applied to Columbia. And back then, Columbia was not coeducational.
Right.
So they send my application across the street to Barnard.
Mm.
And I landed in Barnard. And during the first year in New York City, I actually lived in Chinatown with my aunt because thou shalt not, right, live on your own as the first daughter out of a Chinese family going to college.
Mm.
So that was an interesting cultural experience that needs a drink to talk about. Um, but Barnard was eye-opening. I knew very little about higher education, even though I basically grew up in Miami. Our family knew that education was important, but it knew nothing about financial aid and applications and navigating really a very different system than what my parents knew. And I was an English major. Um, English was my worst subject, and I figured college would do something about that.
Right.
And I was going to be a journalist. And it is, but things change when you go to college. I met my husband. He was a Columbia man,
Mm.
and he was also immigrant, and he was from Korea. And
Mm.
together we said, well, we need to do something different. So we took some Japanese literature classes together, and I fell in love. Both ways. I fell in love with him, fell in love with Japanese literature. And I got a scholarship after I graduated from Barnard to go to Columbia. So I, started working on my doctorate. And the topic was a woman writer, a Japanese woman writer named Enchi Fumiko. She was very extraordinary. She was born in 1905, part of the Japanese blue stocking crew. And a lot of what I learned, both at Barnard and at a woman's college, and doing research on this woman writer, is that the world is built differently. And if you're a woman, and particularly a woman of a different culture, you will always be on the bottom of
Mm.
any social ranking. So it's a kind of a roundabout way of getting at the idea of social justice, even in
Mm.
those early days. And I wanted to be a professor of Japanese literature. and it was all primed to do that. So, and my husband in the meantime was studying to be an architect. So after I finished my orals at Columbia, we moved to Syracuse. Syracuse is a beautiful, beautiful city, but there is very little there for someone majoring in Japanese literature.
Right.
So, I spent a good amount of time there. But ultimately, we decided that we wanted to be somewhere a little bit more cosmopolitan. So we went across Route 90 and came to Boston. My husband was looking at Harvard for further studies, and I was finishing my dissertation. So every graduate student needs to make a living. I needed to make a living, and the only thing that I can do after all those years of studying English was to write. So I applied at Mass Bay Community College to be a publications person. And they asked me at my interview, do you know how to use PageMaker? Remember PageMaker in the good old days?
Oh,
And
yes.
I said, I don't know what the hell this is. So I said, sure, I can do PageMaker, and I'm a really good writer. So they hired me, and then I spent the next 3 days learning how to use PageMaker.
Yeah.
So this is what happens when you have a liberal arts education,
Yeah.
right? It is the kind of flexibility and adaptability that I always talk to my students about. This is what happens.
Yeah.
You study Japanese literature and you go and be a publisher. So one of the things that had me so enthralled was that I was responsible for telling the stories of my students.
Mm.
And it was amazing to me that the students that I was encountering at Mass Bay Community College was so different than the students I saw at Barnard, at Columbia, at elite colleges. That was my environment prior to that. So I always remembered the story of this one young woman who had 2 toddlers or 3 toddlers, I can't remember. But she was in an abusive relationship, and she left. And she was in a shelter. And she was afraid of being stalked.
Mm.
So every time she come to campus, we had to be careful to keep her secret. And it was the kind of struggles and the brilliance that she had to get through and get her degree was something that I have never seen before. And that's how you get hooked, right? You tell one
Yeah.
story like that, and you tell another story of a Chinese restaurant worker who works in Chinatown, but is now becoming a auto mechanic and making a living. I after a while, I really had to decide what I was going to do. So I kept a foot in each world. I was teaching
Yeah.
part-time Japanese literature at BU, and then I was working my way through the community college. And then one day, my provost, no, actually, my college president had an executive staff session with the deans and I, and he turned around to us and said, I just fired the provost. Pam, you're going to be provost for a little while because you're the only one with the doctorate. And I
Oh,
said,
no.
I don't know anything about being a provost. I have a circle of deans who all know better than I do and are more senior than I am. But you don't say no to the college president, right? So I spent the next couple of weeks saying to the circle of deans, but for a degree, you'd be doing the work that I'm doing. So please teach me.
Mm.
And that was really the beginning of a lot of learning and unlearning about what it
Mm.
means to be in higher ed.
You clearly didn't start out with aspirations for higher education leadership. And you weren't looking to be a provost. You weren't dreaming to be a president. But you responded. You responded to opportunities. You weren't afraid to say no when the opportunity was put in front of you, which suggests you're a very curious person.
I think, I'm a little bit of an accidental tourist. And you're right. Even when I was, 12 years into Mass Bay, and I thought I wanted to be a college president, the the impulse back then is not as nuanced as the impulse that I have now to keep me
Mm.
here.
Mm.
Um, the more I know about the gap or the big, huge gulf between the world of the Ivy Plus
Mm.
and the world of community college students and adult students living in low-income communities is just so vast. And one of the reasons why it resonated with me is because of my parents. So my
Yeah.
parents were in their early 30s when they came to Miami with us, and they were middle class, you know. When they were in Hong Kong, they navigated the world just fine. Their family was in trade, and they knew they were giving up a whole way, a whole class system, right? A whole way
Mm.
of life in order for the children to have the education that was so wonderful in Gold Mountain, right? In this beautiful place that's the United States.
Mm.
So I've always thought that some generations gave and some generations receive, and they gave. My dad was and until he retired in his late 60s, um, a waiter all his life. My mom, who passed away 10 years, he's still with us, he's 91.
Mm.
My mom, who passed away about 10 years ago, did garment work, but she brought it home,
Oh.
right? So she can be with the kids. When I think about my students here, the average age of my students is 27, 28, right? If my parents had community colleges when they started their lives in the United States, we would be in a very different place,
Mm.
right? They could be engineers and teachers and, having a profession. Now, it took us one generation to go from wage workers to professionals. My brother and my sisters, they were both professionals. But
Mm.
the kind of struggles that they had to go through, they worked two jobs. I mean, it was, 12-hour days is just a regular day for them.
Sure.
And the experience that I have, I always say to folks, I hope that I'm the last of the first in anything. Nobody should
Mm.
have to be first all the
Mm.
time.
Mm.
Yeah, it might have shaped my character, might have shaped a lot of things, but it could have been so much easier.
Yeah.
So I think you're right, early stories to shape you, but my consciousness of that shaping was not until I came to Bunker Hill.
Yeah. Well, and Bunker Hill is your second presidency.
It's my
So
second presidency.
so tell us, for listeners who aren't familiar with Bunker Hill, and it's the biggest, right? It's the biggest community college in
In Massachusetts.
Massachusetts.
That's right.
So what how do you describe it to people who aren't familiar with Bunker Hill? What are some points of pride or things that you think really set it apart?
It's funny you ask this question because sometimes I say to folks, I would love to tell you that Bunker Hill is so special, we're one of a kind, but we're not. We are pretty typical urban medium-sized community college. So at that point, then I would say, there's over 2,000 community colleges across the country. We're the only kind of institution like this in the world. There are no
Mm.
community colleges anywhere. And you have urban, you have suburban, you have rural. And the largest community colleges are folks like San Francisco City College, are like 50, 60,000 students. And then you have some of my colleagues here, one of the 15 community colleges in Massachusetts. They're about 1,300 students. We're about 1,600, so we're medium size. We serve students within a 10-mile radius. They all come through the orange line, the T.
Mm.
Um, most of 77%, three-quarters of our students are living in the lowest two quintile of income, and that's common for community college students. And I would say over 50 to 60% are either immigrant or have immigrant backgrounds. They live in what I would call gateway cities, or what they call rival cities, where immigrants gather. That's the first place you land, right? So Miami's one of them, the middle of Boston's one of them, Chelsea, Revere, Medford. And almost as many of those students are multilingual. You hear a lot of folks say, oh, well, they don't speak English. Well, they will in a few years. Like, I didn't speak English, but I was fluent in a few years. And once they're multilingual, they become a really strong point of workforce development. and talent development, right? So a lot of our students enter through ESL or enter through the lower rungs of higher education. And then what we do is we make sure that during the time that they're with us, that they grow, right? They get to wherever it is that they need to go. I always tell the story of this gentleman. His name is Quan. He immigrated from Vietnam in his maybe late 20s with his mom, just the two of them. And when he first got here, his English was so bad that the local Whole Foods wouldn't hire him. And then literally 3 or 4 years later, he transferred to MIT as a biomedical engineering major. And now he's working for a large corporation. And not only did he change his entire life here, he also met his wife here, who was also a Vietnamese immigrant. And she went through Cornell after she was here, and she's working in the field. So it's those stories that really defines community college. And you'll hear similar stories across the country where community colleges get students out of generational poverty and put them onto entry-level work, and then they grow. So Quan, who is a wage worker, didn't speak any English, literally transformed in 6 or 7 years into someone who works for a corporation. All of the programming here has that kind of pathways in mind. So you can come in and say, I want to be a nurse, or come in and say, I want to be an engineer. And we would assess you and say, well, you really need to take algebra, or really need to go back into arithmetic or basic English or ESL, but then here's your pathway, right, to get your handholds into transfer and all of those. I am hard pressed to say one community colleges is better than the other, because the idea of a community college movement or ethos is really strong. It didn't matter that I worked 8 years in California and then I came back 10 years ago. I can go anywhere in the United States, go into a community college, and within the next 36 hours, do exactly what I'm doing now at Bunker Hill. There was this one program, and this is funny, called Life Map, which is a counseling program that we use for all of our students. When I first heard about it, it was a program that was used at Valencia Community College in Florida. So I used it, I adopted it when I was in California, when I was at Moore Park. And when I came to Bunker Hill, it was already in place. So it is a network, right? It is a phenomenon that is not well known.
I want to go back to what you shared about your heritage and your identity as a Chinese American woman and an immigrant. This has obviously shaped your leadership. And it sounds like you're perhaps even more aware of that now as you have leaned more deeply into your leadership as your second presidency. Can you say a little bit more about how you see your identity shaping and impacting the way you lead more broadly?
Yeah, I think so. My first 10 to 15 years at the community college was a journey of acquiring skills, right? I mean, it's content skills. What do you have to do when you lead a division? What do you have to do with the budget? What do you do with all this sort of practical stuff? And back then, the whole identity conversation was about acculturation, right? So I go to Barnard, I go to Columbia, I work for community colleges. I learned how to do leadership. And in the 80s, it was leadership in a particular shape and form, right? It's command and control. It is it is about how, learning how to balance budgets and how to get folks shape as a team. It's very top heavy. And I think parallel to that, my acquisition of the American dream, or my understanding of the American dream back then, was that you fit into the American dream, right? You do not carry a dual identity, and that's how you get into a system. I never questioned the fact back then that the system was not built for me. Why wasn't it built for me? That was never a question. But once I have more experience, particularly over the last 10 years, I realized that a lot of the skills that I have is cultural,
Mm,
right? The idea of the meeting before the meeting before the meeting
mm,
to to resolve conflict, the
mm,
respect for experience, the respect for age, the respect for community, all of those things I carry with me, and that I activate them without naming them.
mm,
What Bunker Hill has done is that it has allowed me to name them. And certainly, the revival, the second revival of the civil rights movement, with the murder of George Floyd,
sure.
as well as our experience in COVID, and in seeing how that has impacted communities that have traditionally been marginalized. It's a wake-up call that if we're truly going to activate the other 50% of the talent in the United States, we need to be able to tap into that. And I tapped it, folks tapped into me, and I was willing to be tapped into early, but I lost a great deal, I think, of that cultural identity in the beginning. And it's interesting
Mm,
being able to reclaim it now.
mm,
So, the learning and the unlearning is there. But then I go farther back, right? Why did I pick up Japanese literature instead of Chinese literature or American literature?
right.
One of my one of my one of my professors, and he was the foremost scholar in Japanese literature in America, or in the English speaking world. His name is Donald Keene. Donald Keene and I had this conversation when I applied at Columbia into the Japanese language program. And he asked me this question: why do you want to study Japanese literature? And at the end of the conversation, I realized that I study Japanese literature to understand American literature better.
Mm,
That to study something that's other gives you a better sense of who you are. And in some ways, understanding American culture over 15, 20 years of acquisition really made me realize that I was missing a piece of my own.
mm,
Uh, so, I think it's that interconnectivity back and forth. And more recently, I've been looking at the kind of reform work that community colleges have been doing, because our students are not performing well. They are
mm,
in a system that's not built for them, all right? And we're forcing immigrants into the system. We're forcing students who have not performed well in the past. And we've always said, oh, it's the classroom. They got to do better in math and English. Yes, they do. But the way to do that is not to fail them over and over again,
mm,
but to find that connection, and to find and to develop that curiosity. And for me, my understanding is that you have to allow folks to see something of themselves in a task that they're performing. My Hispanic students, my Black and Brown students, and women, and our adult students who are working all the time, when they come to Bunker Hill, have got to see themselves in the curriculum. They have to see themselves in the brick and mortar of this place.
mm,
They stay.
yeah.
The first time my father visited me when I became a president in California, he has never visited me. He has no idea what I do. So I said, why don't you come? Come to graduation. It was really sad for me to see how intimidated he was by a community college in that big school building,
Mm,
and the pride that he felt and that he showed. He was never an emotional guy,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Old Chinese man. Um, but I realized that that should have been his home. Um,
Mm,
and every single student who comes through the door, I bet, feels a little like that.
sure.
Um,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
it does shape your leadership in that it is not what I need to do as a leader. It's more of who am I not listening to that I should be listening to.
Mm.
Sometimes I worried that in the zeal to do community college work that I speak for my students rather than creating opportunities for them to speak and shape their own lives.
So how does this, as you think about your own identity,
Mm,
how does that inform the approach you've taken to promoting diversity and equity on your campus in particular? Because I know that's been something you've been very involved with
right.
and really pushed for. But how does your own identity development inform the way in which you have approached and supported particular things?
I think it comes in a number of different parts. The folks who have taught me well are actually the folks who are teaching here. It's
Ah,
my faculty. They have been scholars in this area. For example, just one area of language acquisition, language learning. Our ESL faculty have very recently, using one of the federal grants that we applied for, completely reformed our ESL curriculum.
mm,
They took it from like 25 levels. You know how they're all like a million levels?
sure.
They took it down to 3 levels. And they are keeping students from leaving by upping the engagement with the materials that they present. For example, instead of reading a piece on the Industrial Revolution in English, and you're Chinese and your native language is Chinese, or depending on what the breakdown of the race ethnicity of the students are, our faculty would introduce pieces that would be relevant to people's daily lives, the development of Chinatown,
Mm,
or projects that would have to do with the Spanish Harlem, or pieces that would be meaningful, that folks would actually want to be engaged in.
mm,
It's no different than people taking British literature because they love British culture, but it is conscious in that these are the students that we have, right? We're a quarter white, quarter black, quarter Latinx, 15% Asian Pacific. So in order to get folks to stay and connect and engage, you built it into the curriculum. Students must see themselves.
yeah.
And we also make available the other large piece is student services. It's kind of like a three-legged stool, right? One is academic. The students have to see themselves in the curriculum, whatever it is that they're studying. The second part is the social connections. I have no doubt in my mind that if I have a student who's 25, Haitian, living in Dorchester, he is going to connect to a Black gentleman on my campus who is teaching, who's native here to Dorchester than I would as a Chinese American woman. There are just some
Mm,
things that are in both of our cultural background, right?
mm,
And I would relate better to probably a young Asian woman whose experiences that I've had. So we try to, on top of academic counseling, have that type of person-to-person counseling. Even if it's like sometime during, so we have a program called HOPE. It's called Halting Oppressive Pathways Through Education, and it's designed for Black and Brown men.
mm,
Right? So we have peer counselors who have that affinity. We have faculty who volunteered, and students are what I would call never left alone. They get phone calls, they have touch points,
mm,
but one of the most amazing things that they do is that they go out to dinner together.
mm. Yeah.
People looking in from the outside would say, you are wasting, why are you paying for people that go out and have dinner? But what we cannot capture is something that I have with my children, which is with my child, which is we talk about college around the dinner table.
Sure.
For students who are first generation don't have that kind of support. They don't talk about
Right.
that.
Right.
So these are times where you can build those human connections intentionally. So recently I joined our ANAPISI, or our Asian Pacific group of community members. They have something called a community, TEA. They get together and they have tea. And I was listening to their stories and a lot of storytelling of how these are my faculty members and my students, how they as diaspora connected to their family at home, and how
Mm,
their family at home encouraged them in their very lonely academic life,
mm,
because there was no one to talk to.
right.
And the whole phenomenon of sending money home,
Yeah.
having young brothers and sisters come to them in the United States, and they become a family unit, and then they stay.
Mm,
So I think a lot of it is being conscious that, yes, while you do all of the technical stuff in the classroom, there's the human pieces. And these groups do come together. We have celebrations that are multicultural. So it's about solidarity as well as affinity. So you
yeah.
have pieces. And it's tricky because you have to be balanced and seeing that these are all wonderful cultural attributes, and you don't end up pitting one against the other, right? The Black and the Asian tension. There's sometimes you get the Blacks and Korean tension, or the Hispanic and the Black tension, right? You see it in
Sure.
society. And right now, the Israeli and the Palestinian pieces.
Right.
So what we managed to do is to be very specific and very special, but also very, very general and individualistic and communal in our shared immigrant experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have had we've had a lot of difficult conversation, but we have had no conflict.
I know you've written and spoken a lot elsewhere about your belief, your philosophy that student success is not just about academic learning, but it's about this broader sense of engagement and connection that you're working hard to make happen for students according to who they are as individuals. And I think that's a really profound way to approach this. Um,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. That is, I'm so thankful that you said that.
yeah,
One of the really difficult thing to juggle as a community college president versus a president in a 4-year or more selective institution is that the world sees us, and rightly so, as a workforce development engine, right? You get those folks who are poor, they're not working, they need to get off the dole, go learn and get a job, right? That is the stereotypical story. And yeah, community colleges are really good about that. You be a phlebotomist and you go be a coder or whatever it is. And that's fine. That is really an important role for us to create that first step. But if we only do that, what we're basically doing is creating second-class citizens, second-class workers, right? That they will not go beyond this particular point because we don't believe they can. My goal is, if you're really pushing the American dream, the true American dream is civic engagement and to be a citizen and participate in everything that is social and political and economic about our society. And the only thing that you can do that, the only way that you can do that is to believe that you have more than 10 people in your population who can be leaders.
right. Yeah, for
Right.
sure. Yeah.
And anyone who is an ESL right now has every potential to be a college president anywhere or whatever it is that they want to do. So it is having a different kind of narrative telling to different sectors of my audience. What I say to my legislators has to be somewhat different than what I say to our industry partners, than parents to these students, to the students themselves, right? And to folks who are in higher ed philosophy or higher ed leadership. Because the trajectory is the same. But ultimately, what keeps me here as leader is that if an 11-year-old Chinese girl can come to the United States with no language, with working class parents, who's a waiter and a seamstress, and become a college president, than any one of my students can be. Or a good friend of mine, well, not a good friend, actually a colleague in a what I see as a mentor of mine used to say, don't be so worried about the English acquisition, because every 3-year-old in Spain speaks Spanish. You let them have the language long enough and they'll speak it. And if that's the key to open up everything else, like a liberal arts education, then they will be okay as long as you believe it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's all about time and money. To get to that point of engagement and citizenship, it's about having the leisure to engage. And leisure is about earning money. And it all comes about with opportunity costs. If my students can go to school 3/4 time or full time, like most 4-year college students, the success rates that you see at community colleges would double and triple.
Mm.
It's how do you, I call it community college math, right? If you want greater success, then you got to realize that everybody's got 80 hours in a week.
Right. Yeah.
If you're working full time 40 hours and you're sleeping at least 20 hours, then you
Well,
only have
you're,
time.
yeah, you exactly. Now, and that actually leads me to another topic that I know is very near and dear to your heart, and that's the free community college movement,
Yes.
which is one way of getting at this, what it's taking or what it takes to get that education to get started. Um, so it's something you've been very involved with. It's the Mass Reconnect initiative. For our listeners who may not be familiar with this, can you just give a brief, what is this movement, this initiative, and how is it working, and why do you put so much of your own energy and hope into this? Why are you hopeful and excited about this?
So Mass Reconnect is a state-supported program here in Massachusetts
Mhm.
for residents, well, actually for permanent residents and citizens, 25 and over. And now there's a parallel program actually for undocumented students. So basically you've got free community college going. And the next step for Mass Reconnect is there's a conversation now going on statewide, now that Mass Reconnect is moving, for there to be free community college for everyone. Right. So one of the things that really changed the literacy level and the economic vitality of the United States is universal K-12,
Mhm.
right? Universal secondary education. And I would say 20, 30 years ago, a college diploma will get you a good job supporting families and children. I mean, my in-laws, that's what they had. They had a high school graduation. They worked for Pittsburgh Plate Glass. They supported families, bought a house, all that stuff, right? They retired, they had vacations. The high school diploma was then what a community college or at least some post-secondary training must be now, because technology has moved on and 75% of all the jobs that are being produced now and into the future, and even more so into the future, is going to need that training and technology. So unless we make that training available to everyone, our economy is going to start to shrink because our workforce will start to shrink. So in some ways, if your economy shrinks, your workforce shrinks, your level of daily living will shrink, and we will fall off being the top of the economic scale across the global world.
Mm.
So in some ways it's practical, but the other is that this is the beginning of the participation in a civic institution,
Mm.
right? So if someone goes to college through Mass Reconnect, is there any chance that their children wouldn't?
Right.
It is really, in some ways, a training both in education and the content and in sensibility, but it's also a multi-generational movement, right?
Mhm.
And it is going to probably not cost us as much as we think because the economy will fuel it. People getting off public assistance will fuel it. The lack of generational poverty will fuel it. We'll be happier people. Community colleges is going through probably the most important transformation that it can go through in the 100-year movement that I've been going through it.
Mm.
There is, and here's the other thing, 18 years ago, nobody wanted to have babies. So we've got a population cliff coming, right? We're going to have 25%, we have now 25% less graduates coming out of high school, and that many fewer going to college. Only about 70% of our students go to college coming from high school, and now it's 50% because of COVID.
Mm.
So we are relying on adults, mostly immigrants in gateway cities, to be filling those workforce jobs. And what they need the most is higher education. I mean, we have folks who are nurses and accountants and technicians who are speaking a second language. The only thing that they need to turn on that workforce talent for the United States is language.
Mm.
And they can do it here. So yeah, this has caught my imagination and
Yeah.
has moved
Yeah.
very quickly.
Yeah.
At least I think over 40 states now across the nation have some sort of free community college, either individually at colleges that supports it through foundations, or the state, or if it's federal. Right. So it's pretty powerful. It's
Yeah.
pretty powerful.
And accelerating, which I think is a really, really good thing for all the reasons that you've articulated.
Yeah.
Now, you're also, I think I've heard you talk about the early college movement
Yeah.
as
Oh,
something you are also very excited about. And I know that's a significant initiative there for you at Bunker Hill. Uh, Anything you want to say about how that's going and where you see it going?
yeah, a couple of observations on the ground. I think it's really exciting. Well, advanced placement has always been a thing, right? When I went to college,
Right,
it was the thing. And it was only in the past available to students who are at the top tier. They were skimming the top, right? So you get a 5, you don't have to go
right.
to English and so on. The early college movement now is slightly different in that it has the idea of equity and inclusivity built into it. So you can have students who are B students, ordinary students who are not high achievers at high schools participating in early college. They get maybe 12 credits before they leave
Mhm.
high school, and they carry that into college with them. They are good students. They're willing to study, and they get through these college courses just fine. And all of that transfers, right? So my son is a good example of that. So he took a bunch of summer courses in early college. He took AP, um, and by the time he applied, and he's a public school kid. He went to UMass Amherst.
Uh-huh.
He carried a semester's worth of credits with him.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
saved me thousands and thousands and thousands
Yes.
of dollars.
Yeah.
But not only that, he said to me when he was taking his English course here, he did it in the summertime, and he did it between 6 and 10, Monday and Wednesday. So I would wait for him in my office.
Ah,
The first time he took that class, he came running back to my office and he said, Mom, this is incredible. They're all different ages. They all do different things. They all speak different languages. High school is not like this. I said,
yeah.
honey, this is the real world.
Oh, that must have been music to your ears, Pam.
It
You're,
was just until I heard it from my child, right? I just
yeah,
thought he
yeah,
needed to take some credits, and so it's
yeah,
not
yeah,
so expensive when he goes to college. But it
yeah.
gives students a different sensibility about what it means to have lifelong learning,
Yes.
you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
So I think education, as much as we always say, These polls are saying, well, folks don't have confidence in education or higher education or K-12 education. When you're close enough to what's actually happening, it's pretty amazing stuff happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And we need voices like yours who are articulating that. There needs to be that counter voice about all the good things that are happening, because it is significant. And too oftentimes the noise drowns out
It
the
does.
positive. Yeah.
You know, I want to tell you about, or your audience about one more program that I think
Yeah.
is crystal clear to me, that immigration is the way that we build our country, and it will continue to be part of the way that we build our country. It's called the Welcome Back Center for Foreignly Trained Nurses. We've had it for 10 years. And out of that program, we've produced more than 500 registered nurses that are short everywhere, right? So you would have immigrants who would come from, let's say, Central America or the Asian countries and so on, and they are nurses in their own country,
Mm-hmm.
certified. But when they come to the United States, they cannot practice until they've taken the board exam, a board exam called the NCLEX.
Mm-hmm.
So what we do is we ask them to come in, we assess where they are in language, and we give them language instruction. But then we also give them components that are missing in the programs in their home countries, like community leadership. That's not something they have, right? So they do that with our nursing program. And once they're ready, we have these simulation tests and stuff, once they are simulated to the point where they're ready, they take their exam and they're immediately credentialed as nurses. We have doctors, foreign doctors, we have foreign accountants, foreign plumbers, foreign, everything that you can name that is in our workforce. We have immigrants here. Every single cab driver from here that I've had from here from campus to Logan Airport
Yeah.
has been one of those professionals. So I do a
That's
lot
true.
of recruiting.
Yes, I bet you do.
But what a waste of talent, right?
Yeah.
For us not to tap into that.
Yeah. Now that's a very innovative and valuable way to meet a need that is so obvious.
It really
And yet it not many are doing anything about that. So kudos to you and your team there. Now I do need to ask you about you were recently appointed the chair to the U.S. Secretary of Labor Advisory Committee on Apprenticeship, which sounds like a big thing, a big responsibility. So what is that about? You were appointed by Marty Walsh, is that right?
I was. So
Yeah.
Secretary Walsh, who is now still Secretary Walsh, because we do refer to him that way. But in my mind, he will always be the mayor, right?
Yeah, yeah, right.
So he called one day and said, please come and serve, and you don't say no. The Department of Labor has under it the Office of Registered Apprenticeships.
Uh-huh.
And there is federal funding that actually supports the creation of apprenticeship programs. The most well-known ones are, of course, the successful ones that the construction trade runs, right? That you become an apprentice and then you join the union and you make a really terrific living. And half of your knowledge is from hands-on, and the other half or quarter is from taking classes. And it is one way for a lot of students to get their first job and reach into the middle class, and get it into good jobs, really good jobs. The appointment that I had was for 2 years. It just finished. Were produced a bunch of recommendations that are going into place. It was a committee of 30 people, a third of it from labor, a third of it from industry, and a third of it from area experts. And I was sort of the cat herder. And we addressed a number of issues that were current and urgent for the Office of Apprenticeships in order to improve the programming of this federal funded programs. One of which is, how do we create apprenticeships and make them available for everyone?
Mm,
right? So whether you are from marginalized communities or disabled communities or communities of women and populations that needed the help, needed to be included, but also the fact that we have emerging industries, clean industries, blue and green, fintech, fine tech, all of those
sure.
things are going to define our future. How do we allow apprenticeships to be a model of learning?
Mm,
Um, so it was the discussions are good. There are a lot of philosophical differences that must be worked out,
mm,
but folks on that committee are so committed. And we've seen wonderful, wonderful examples. There was this one high school in Colorado that was an apprenticeship high school. They had 6 different tracks, and all of the tracks are leading to an apprenticeable career. And
mm,
students are working for the industry and going to school at the same time.
mm,
So we are creating an apprenticeship hub here at Bunker Hill to broaden what we want to do with registered apprenticeships. And the city of Boston and also the chamber. The chamber is also working on apprenticeships. So I think apprenticeship, like community colleges, is going through a transformation.
mm.
It is not just construction anymore, but we take that best practice and move it across all the other industries. That's the
Yeah,
goal.
that's exciting. So we can look forward to seeing where this goes, and particularly there on the ground at Bunker Hill with the work you're
Yeah,
going to be doing.
yeah,
So,
I think
so,
so.
so our time is up, and I have one final question that I need to ask you. Um, you have referenced the fact that community colleges are challenged these days. All of higher education is challenged, but the community college sector has its own unique set of challenges. What advice do you give to emerging leaders, new presidents of community colleges, first-time presidents, especially in these rapidly changing times? Do you have one or two things that either you do give as advice or you'd like to give as advice?
This is interesting because I have a really good student government association and they go out and they do advocacy work.
Yeah,
And the president and the vice president nailed me one day in the gym when we were having some activity. And she says, "Well, how do we think about this? How should we think about this?" And I said to them, don't get really complicated. Everybody needs money, everybody needs resources. That's not the way to think about it. You need to go a level up. The question that you need to ask yourself is, who exactly are our students? Right? Because if you ask folks 30 years ago and you say, well, what's a college student? The college student would be, well, 18 to 22, 2 parents, living in the suburbs, can call home for money if they run out of money and they party, right? That's your
yeah,
college student. Our college students don't look like that anymore. They are everything that I've just told you, right? They work full time, they have families, they're all of these different kinds. And until you know how many different types of students like that are at your college, and you can shape your curriculum so that they can see themselves in it, and you shape your services so they can feel like they're in a system that's created for them, that is such a complex field that depending on what college you're at, that answer will sound different, which
yeah,
means we all have different solutions for students.
yeah,
But it
yeah.
is so they went out and they used that and hopefully it worked for them. I haven't heard back from them, but
Oh, good
that
for
would be
them.
my advice. Know
Yeah,
who your students are because they're not what you thought they were.
yeah. And that's good advice, as you say, for any college and university leader these days, is to start by understanding who it is that you're
Sort of.
set up to serve. Yeah. So Pam, thank you so very much. This has been such a pleasure. You have such a terrific reputation as a leader in Massachusetts, and it's been great to have you and to learn more about your story of leadership. I understand
Well,
why it is that you are so highly respected.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. And I always have an ask, right? And you fulfill this ask already, which is tell the story to somebody who doesn't know.
Oh,
There's just not enough, there's not enough conduits in the world to tell the story of folks who've been neglected. And there's such talent in our world. It's a really hopeful way to do work.
yeah.
So thank you for
Oh,
giving me the opportunity.
you are welcome. So best wishes in this new year to you and to Bunker Hill.